Good work.
Good evening. Welcome. Thanks for coming, and many of you coming early. I have a few announcements, so I'll get started before we have our speaker. Just for those of you who watch history and like sports, Mr. Polanco started his career tonight. He popped out, but at least he's here and he's starting to bat for the Pirates. So we got that out of the way. I'm Mike Ehrman. I'm chairman of this group, and see old faces and new, and we welcome all of you. First thing I want to tell you is that we had just an absolutely marvelous walking tour of Homewood Cemetery the other day. It was just great fun, and we'll do it again next June. Just to give you a preliminary alert, we'll go to some different sections, but it was just outstanding. Lots of talks coming up I need to tell you about, but before that, there's some new people here. We've got membership forms in the back. It's not obligatory. You can come to these meetings without it, but we like members, and we hope that we get some new ones to sign up here. It's just $10 for individuals. Next month is our last month before we take an August break. David Grinnell, who now works for the University of Pittsburgh Library System, has been here before, was part of a twosome, gave a marvelous speech on the Thaw family. David's going to come and talk about unknown stories from Pittsburgh department stores. We have one of our oldest members has been pushing for a department store talk for a long time, and we finally got David to come. In September, Al Tandler, that some of us have heard, who's a chief architectural historian at Pittsburgh History and Landmarks, is going to come and talk about 20th century architecture. And his knowledge, he's written a book, his knowledge base is really great on that. The next October, Chris Rawson from PG, he's participated in the writing of a book on August Wilson, and he's going to talk about August Wilson, a Pittsburgh story. I don't have the, well, here I do. In November, remember we had a sick out. Melanie Gutowski was going to come and talk about Squirrel Hill Mansions, and she's coming in November. December, Joel Tarr, who has been here before to talk about horses, he's now going to come and talk about gas. Early gas exploration in the East End. So that'll be in December. And just to give you a sense, you don't see it on the schedule yet, but in January we're going to have a talk on the history of 9 Mile Run. Later on, we're going to have the director of the Warhol Museum come and talk about Andy Warhol and how they built that museum. And in May, I ran across a talk opportunity. There are seats up here. We've got some seats up front as well as the back. Welcome to you all. There's a new museum in Braddock. It's called the Braddock Battlefield History Center. It's a labor of love by a gentleman who worked at Dollar Bank for many years. And the Braddock Battlefield, or the Battle of Monongahela, is not very well known. It's from 1754, and it was a critical battle, and he's going to come and talk. So we're at work getting talks to come.
I was there this morning. The museum's great. It's worth gallery. It's small, but it's great. He's extremely knowledgeable. He's the dosage picture.
Yeah. And they also have some wonderful movies there that are the best French and Indian war stories I've ever seen. So he'll be coming in May. So that's later. Tonight, we're very happy to have Michael Kraus come. Michael is a native of Newcastle, but had a lot of Squirrel Hill experience through a family member. He can talk a little about that if he wishes. He, lifelong interest in history, went to Edinburgh. He is at this point the director of the historical collections at Soldiers and Sailors in Oakland, but also is a sculptor and is just an all-around history nut. Is that right?
Yep.
Michael, welcome.
a history nut in Squirrel Hill. That makes sense. I consider myself partially a Squirrel Hill person because my grandmother worked and lived here. She lived on Forbes Avenue and worked at Linton's department store for a million years. So we visited her, you know, we ran up and down the street, and so I feel like this is a second home. But tonight I'm going to take us on a little trip. It's difficult to talk about Pittsburgh in the Civil War because the story is so huge. There's so many aspects, so many different sides that you could examine Pittsburgh in the war. And just alone, just to give you a statistic, there were 25,490 men from Allegheny County who served in the Civil War. So, you know, if we look at every one of these, their stories, we'd be here for an awful long time. So what I choose to do is, I am a historian, but I like, my trip through history in the Civil War era is through the camera. Because I believe that the camera was at the time was a new invention, or a pretty new invention. It was invented in the 1840s, and by the 50s, the technology started to spread, and it came here, and it started to permeate every little town, and common people started having their pictures taken. So it was just in time for the Civil War, and you know that's what my look in the war is going to show us. If you go to the next slide, please. Before that time, okay, there we go. There you go. There we go. There it is. Okay. Before there was photography, we depended on illustrators to tell our stories. This is a woodcut illustration, one of the very first printed illustrations of the city of Pittsburgh, looking up the river at the point, and you can see the steamboat. I don't know if you can actually see it. It says SS Pittsburgh, just so there's no question about where it's from. And again, Pittsburgh with no H. But the point is here, and you look upriver to where the Smithfield Street Bridge is, and along the river you can see all the steamboats. That's the wharf. That's what floods out every spring, and it's called the wharf because it was a wharf. That's where the steamboats came up and landed and did their business. It was always dirty. It was always muddy. It was always flooding and up and down. No different than today. It's very much like today. But that's where all the activity was. And you can also see the smoky fireplaces. This is early industry. Some bridges across the Allegheny River are covered bridges. Horses do not like to cross water that's moving very fast. So in order to keep them calm, bridges were covered. So you see those covered bridges. But this is how we got our view of history. Even portraits, people, there were woodcuts, paintings, etchings, and the like. But if you show the next slide, please. What's going to change is the camera. And my focus here, all the pictures you're going to see are Western Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania-oriented pictures. This is a photographer. His name was Gudekunst. He's a Philadelphia photographer. He's a very famous photographer. But he's leaning on the camera. And you see how big this instrument is. And a camera at that point in time, having a picture taken was a lengthy process. The plate was sensitized, put in the camera, exposed, and developed immediately. So you actually got your print right away. And it was actually the piece of glass or tin or copper plated with silver that was in the camera. And that's what you received. Because it's so bulky and heavy, it's going to limit what it can see. And it's going to limit, I like to look at that as in who is the client, who's buying our photograph. Number one customer is going to be the trade that walks in to have their portrait taken. And these people are going to be people of some means. It was a little bit expensive to have a portrait taken. You dressed in your finest clothes, you walked in the studio, and the bottom was a store because they want to sell you something. They had photo albums and cases and frames and periphery. And as you went up to the second or third floor, there was a skylit room with glass skylight, and you would sit for your portrait, which the portrait exposure was anywhere from 5 seconds to 30 seconds. And there actually was a brace that was held behind your head, that held your head still so you did not move. And I don't know if any of our photos are here going to show that, but keep that in mind when you see this. So this limits us for where it's going to go. And again, the clients are going to be people of money or who are sitting for a portrait, or people who are of business who are going to have a picture taken of their wares, their shop, or the photographer himself may take the camera out of doors and try to capture some scenes because he thinks he'll be able to sell them. He's not capturing them for social consciousness and the greater good. He's trying to make money on it. But in the meantime, he does capture, the photographer will capture everyday life. And if we look at the next slide, this was taken in Sharon, Pennsylvania, close to where I grew up. This is the Pennsylvania Extension Canal, a common scene, an outdoor scene. The photographer is taking this picture for the boat owner, for the businessman. But what we see in it is the coal yards, there are coal hills behind, and the canal craft is segmented into different sections, which would be different grades of coal. And you notice the two cabins. One cabin was for the captain of the ship, and the boat would be pulled by mules along the towpath. In the other cabin was another set of mules. So while one set of mules rested, the other one worked, and they could keep continuously pulling. So this is a really great look at an everyday scene. Let's look at another. Let's look at the next one. These two boys are employees at an ironworks here in Pittsburgh. It was called the Schwab Ironworks. There's a great photo album in the collection of the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society at Heinz History Center. The owner of the iron foundry had portraits taken of all of his workers, and he showed them with their tools. So you see these boys with the tools that they were working with. And here the camera captures child labor, which is something that wasn't often photographed. It captures the condition that these boys are in. They were in horrible conditions. They were malnourished, stunted growth. You can see this young man, his growth is stunted. That young man, he was called an iron puddler, and that big long iron stick he used when they opened the gate of the molten iron, he would pull the molten iron so it flowed down onto the floor. And you can imagine it would spit and sputter, and he's not wearing any protective clothing, but this really shows us what the child conditions were, working conditions were in our city here in Pittsburgh. Let's go to the next one. Here the camera captures some children on Oil Creek up around Oil City. These two are poor children. These are not wealthy children that went to have their picture taken. The camera operator is trying to document oil scenes because of the oil boom up in that region in the early 1860s. These children are called oil dippers, and what they would do would be to sit along the creek. Their parents or their father worked in the oil fields. They sat along the creek, and a lot of the oil percolated out of the ground or wells, and it traveled down the rivers, and their job was to take a scoop, a big pan, and to wade into the water, scoop up the oil blobs and stick them into those drums, and that way they could make extra money for their family. So this is, again, the labor conditions that were happening around the time of the Civil War. Next, please. The camera is also going to capture families, and this is this photograph captures several generations of one family, and you'll notice the child in the center. And yes, the child is a corpse; it's not living. This was a very common practice to take post-mortem photography in those days. Photography is new. There are no boundaries for it. There's no ethical, blackballing of this kind of a portrait. It was very common. It was the last, maybe the first and last look they would have at a deceased family member. Child mortality was very high. You see the mother in the back grieving, the siblings, the father is also looking down, and these are probably the two grandmothers that are seated in the front. Poignant story. It's a Western Pennsylvania picture. I don't know the identities of these people, but again, it shows, and these people had some money. They're dressed nicely, they're in their finest clothes, and they've chosen to take the baby to the studio. There are also a number of photographs where the camera operator travels to the house, and they prop the deceased up, or he's on a bed, and they'll actually strike a picture of him. So this is another mode of photography during the 1850s and 60s. Next, please. Some of the pictures I've been showing you are what we call occupational photographs, where they show the subjects are in their occupation. This is a man of African descent. The picture came out of the Beaver Falls region. He appears to be a minister by his dress and the buttons, the cloth-covered buttons, and the neckwear that he's wearing. But this picture has always fascinated me because I love to look at his hands. And his hands, to me, look like the hands of a former slave. I mean, he has very powerful hands. And I really wish I knew his story, but I'm going to make one up and say that he was a slave and he came north and was a minister and had his photograph taken. I'm looking for a way to identify this photo. There are some threads that haven't panned out yet, but hopefully someday I hope to identify this man and his story. Next, please. This is Allegheny Arsenal on Butler and 40th Street. We're looking from the location of Arsenal School, looking down. The gate, the first gate here, would open up right onto Butler Street, and the opposite gate, which is the famous gate, there are many photographs taken of that. Behind there is the drugstore and the warehouses that are on the lower part of where the arsenal was. These are all mortar tubes, cannon tubes that are laying here. That's the stables on the right. As you progress up the hill, where was the powder magazine and the laboratories, where women rolled cartridges and loaded shells, and it's there. And on September 17th, 1862, there was an accident where the laboratories exploded due to poor conditions. Powder was leaking. There was gunpowder everywhere, and 78 women, mostly women, 78 people were killed in that explosion. Mostly immigrants and lower-class working women, and some children who were involved with work at the arsenal. The arsenal was founded in 1814. It sits right on the Allegheny River. It was a good place for the federal government to... this was the frontier still in those days, so this is where muskets, powder, and all those kind of things were stored, and then they were shipped west. This was the western point. By the time of the Civil War, it became... There was nothing. There were no cannons manufactured here. What was manufactured here were cartridges, like I said, shells, artillery caissons, saddles, saddle gear, leather gear, and those type of things were made at Allegheny Arsenal. It operated till around 1919. That's when the parcel was sold off where the school is. And there are still a few buildings left. One is the powder magazine, which is on 40th Street. It's a bathroom now, but it's a low stone building in an L shape. That's an original building. And there are one or two original buildings on the south side towards the river. Next, please. This is the kind of equipment that would have passed through Allegheny Arsenal. This is a 3-inch ordnance rifle. It was a technologically superior weapon during the Civil War. It's a rifled cannon, meaning that there are grooves cut in the barrel, and it increased its range and accuracy. That particular gun, this photograph is so clear, it's not clear in this slide, but the original is so clear you can read the barrel. It says Phoenixville Arsenal, which was in the Philadelphia area. But it's a very typical gun that was used by light artillery batteries. Many of the Pittsburgh light artillery batteries, Hampton's battery, Thompson's battery, Cooper's battery, all use this type of gun. So it's important to kind of know what our boys from Pittsburgh were servicing. Let's go to the next, please. This was a cannon that was cast here in Pittsburgh. This is a Rodman gun. Thomas Jackson Rodman was an ordnance officer for the United States Army. He was a brilliant man. He was interested in science and technology. Before he discovered the way, and I'll explain the casting in a second, cannons were cast in a solid piece, and then they were bored out when they cooled. They bored the muzzle out. But at a solid piece of iron that big, if you imagine how it's cooling from molten metal, it cools at different temperatures, and it stretches and pulls apart. And the tube actually is weak. A cannon poured that way is really only good for 200 or 300 or 400 shots before it's in danger of blowing up. So it was not a great system to make guns with. And Rodman designed a way to cool. He had the bore in the mold, but he had water that flowed through the bore casting when the molten metal was poured, and it cooled it more evenly. It made the inside of the bore really hard, and it was a very superior product. And because of that, they could increase the size of the cannons. This is the largest gun that was ever made during the war. It was it took a 20-inch shell that weighed 1,000 pounds, and with the right charge of powder, it could throw that projectile 8,000 yards. And just to give you an idea, the gun itself, there were only 2 of these ever made. It actually came out at the very end of the war, and was just, there was no need for them at that point in time. But it weighed 36,000 pounds, and the railroad car was specially designed to transport it. I think there's still one of them at West Point, and I don't know where the other one is, but you can see the man that's in the tube there, so you can imagine just how big this thing is. Next, please. This is a great portrait, even if we didn't know who it was, and if we look at it as, who is the client, it's obvious the sitter is the client. This is Edward McMaster Stanton. He was Lincoln's Secretary of War. He was a very bullheaded but brilliant man. He was from Steubenville, Ohio originally, but settled in Pittsburgh for a time and had a law career here, and was very partial to Pittsburgh. Wrote some letters when he went to Washington to work, wrote some letters back here telling his friends that war was imminent and they better be prepared for it, and it was a good chance to make some money. So he kind of saw the handwriting on the wall. And it's Stanton who, at Lincoln's assassination, says he now belongs to the ages, and it's Stanton who suppresses all the evidence of the Lincoln assassination, and some pages of Booth's diary go missing, but he is a very interesting and compelling man. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the other famous Andy from Pittsburgh. We have Andy Warhol and we have Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie has a Civil War presence. In 1861, he was superintendent of the military railroads, and he was in charge of the Union government's telegraph lines. And he actually sent a telegram from Washington to Harrisburg ordering troops to be raised to protect Washington. So he always identified with that. He always identified with the fact that he was a military telegrapher, even though he was never in the Army. And at Soldiers and Sailors, we have a plaque, a big bronze plaque dedicated to the military telegraphers. It was dedicated in 1911. It was cast by Tiffany Studios, and it was paid for by Andrew Carnegie. And he's in the center of it. Next, please. We're going to look at some of the people, Western Pennsylvania people, kind of a cross-section and some stories about them. If you look at this young man, first of all, you may be impressed by his youth. He is very young. He's maybe at most 16 years old. And I know you know that the North wore blue uniforms and the South wore gray uniforms. And when we look at him, and we might think right away he's a Confederate soldier. But in fact, he's not. Pennsylvania, like many northern states, had a militia system before the war, and those militia soldiers were provided uniforms from the state, and they were gray. So this is a young man wearing a Pennsylvania state militia uniform. And if you know about the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run in April of 1861, the very first battle, there were Union troops wearing gray uniforms and Confederate troops wearing blue uniforms, and they fired upon each other and their own side. One of the lessons from the Battle of Bull Run was that uniforms needed to be standardized and battle flags needed to be standardized, or we're going to kill each other before the enemy kills us. So this portrait was taken, we know this portrait was taken in 1861 before the Pennsylvanians, when they were called to service, would typically travel to Harrisburg, be outfitted in uniforms, and then travel to Washington for camp of instruction, and then be given federal uniforms. So he's somewhere in that process between either Western Pennsylvania and Harrisburg, but before he got to Washington. His name is Josiah Hannon. He's from Lawrence County, where I grew up. He was, I think, around 16 or 17 when this photograph was taken. I bought his family trunk at an auction probably 25 years ago. The family photograph was in there. The hat he's wearing in that picture was in the trunk and I still have it. And on the back of the hat, on the brim of the hat, his name is engraved in it, and it has whirling stars and decorations. And I searched, all his letters were there too. In fact, there were 4 brothers who were soldiers. And I searched through his letters before I knew that Pennsylvania wore gray, hoping to find him saying, I'm sending home a Confederate cap. Well, he didn't. He was killed in 1862 at the Battle of South Mountain, which was one of the precursor battles to Antietam. So his hat was saved by the family, and the photograph was saved by the family, and they still exist today, which is amazing. Next, please. This is General John Geary. He was from Westmoreland County. He stood 6'5", 6'6". You can see he's a large man. He was originally the colonel of the 28th Pennsylvania. He rose in ranks. He was a military man through and through. He eventually became a brigade commander. He was a brigade commander at Gettysburg, and then a corps commander. He was a very significant corps commander at the in the battles around Atlanta. He had a young son named Eddie, who was a 19-year-old following in his father's footsteps. Eddie was assigned to an infantry regiment first, then transferred to an artillery regiment under his father's command. And his father held Eddie's commission in his hand, but that night there was a battle. This was in Wauhatchie, Georgia, and Eddie was killed. And when John found him, he still had the commission in his pocket, but his entire staff just gave him some breathing space, and it's just reported he just knelt by his son's body and wept. So it's very touching. A very hard man like this could be so touched, emotionally touched. Next slide, please. This is a guy every Pittsburgher should know. His name is Alexander Hayes. He's buried in Allegheny Cemetery. He has a great monument. He was a veteran of the Mexican War. He was a graduate of West Point, and his class, one of his classmates was Ulysses Grant. They were good friends in the war with Mexico. Hayes raised a regiment called the 63rd Pennsylvania. He commanded that regiment for a brief time, and he was elevated to the rank of brigadier general. He was wounded once, had a horse fall on him once. He was probably an alcoholic, and he was probably addicted to opiates for the pain, because it was reported many times he was as he looked like he was drunk. But he was a dynamic commander. At Gettysburg, the brunt of Pickett's charge hit his line, and his line repelled them. He had enough sense to have his men gather empty muskets and load them all. He had hundreds of empty muskets laying around. He just exploited his position. When the Confederates were retreating, he had his men go out and pick up battle flags, Confederate battle flags. They picked up 22 Confederate battle flags in front of their lines, which is the most battle flags that were ever captured in the Civil War. And to kind of rub it in, Hayes got 2 of his staff members at Gettysburg while the Confederates were retreating from Pickett's charge, and this is the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. They've just lost 7,000 men in 20 minutes, and they're retreating. And Hayes orders his staff, 2 of his staff members, to grab 3 of the battle flags, bring the horses up. They brought the horses up, and he and his staff members rode along the Union lines, dragging Confederate battle flags in the dirt behind them, which electrified the Union soldiers, and it scared the Confederate soldiers. They thought he was a madman. But he was a real, I think he's a real Pittsburgher. He had real Pittsburgh, kahunas. He was, at the Battle of Wilderness, he was not liked in the higher command. He thought he should have been a major general, and he was overlooked many times. At the Battle of Wilderness, as a brigadier general, he stopped to talk to some of his guys from Pittsburgh in the 63rd, and he was killed by a sniper's bullet in the head. Let's look at the next slide, please. The man on the right is Colonel Strong, Vincent, and you may know that name as a high school in Erie, but he was a real man. And it's funny because many people think that it has to do with muscles and Vincent, but Strong was his mother's maiden name, so that was a common practice in those days to carry both names. Vincent was 26 years old. He was a lawyer. He rose to command of the 83rd Pennsylvania. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he is with his brigade. There's some trouble on Little Round Top, if you've been to Gettysburg. The Union command sends for, they need a brigade up there as soon as possible, and they send for Vincent's commander, who is drunk. And Vincent knows he's drunk. Vincent intercepts the rider and says, "I will take the orders, what are they?" So he personally took command, took his men in a foot race to the top of Little Round Top, placed them in strategic positions, and repelled a very dangerous enemy attack on the left of the Union line. If you saw the movie Gettysburg, that's where Joshua Chamberlain comes from, but it's Vincent that puts him there. The man on the left is Vincent's standard bearer named Oliver Wilcox Norton. He's also from Erie, Pennsylvania. Norton carried a flag, and he rode beside Vincent always, because that marked where Vincent was. And when they got up on the hill, scouting the position, they were drawing fire, and Vincent looked at Norton and said, "Norton, get that flag out of here. You know, they're looking at us and they're shooting. Go take it around the corner and just hold my horse and wait for me." Well, he never came back because Vincent was in the middle of the attack on Little Round Top. The line began to break. Vincent jumped up on a rock, whipped his men back into line with his riding crop, which was a gift from his wife. And in that moment, he was exposed to the Confederate fire. He was on a rock, pushing his men back into where they belonged, and he was felled by a bullet in the thigh and into the groin. He was carried from the field, and he died a few days later. But Wilcox Norton was very distraught because he idolized him. And Norton would actually go on to write a book called Attack and Defense of Little Round Top, where he chronicles the whole battle. It's a great book, and there's much more I could say, but I'd talk all night about these two guys. So let's go to the next slide. Here's a great Pittsburgher. This is Dog Jack. Dog Jack was a pit bull terrier. He was a stray. He wandered into the Niagara Fire Company, which I have forgotten where that is. I think it's up on Penn Avenue. It was up on Penn Avenue at the time. The firemen didn't like him. They threw things at him. They kicked him. They hurt him. One time they broke his leg, and they felt sorry for him after that, so they nursed him back to health, and he became their mascot at the fire company. He rode on the fire engines with them. He was one of the family. When the war broke out, the whole fire company enlisted, and they took Jack with them. And Jack was a you can see he was a veteran of, I don't know, 15 or 20 battles. He was wounded twice. Once he almost died. He was captured twice. Once he escaped, and once he was traded. They traded him for several Confederate officers, and they got their dog back. Which shows you what Confederate officers are worth. I didn't really mean that. But he's wearing, if you notice, he's wearing a beautiful collar. And this was a presentation collar they had made for him. It was silver, and it was very valuable. And they would let Jack wander all over the place because he always came back. But they were in Frederick, Maryland, kind of out of the scene of battle, and he wandered off and never came back, and it's not known what happened to him. The men in the regiment surmised that he was killed for his collar because it was valuable. So that's Jack the hero dog. Next, please. These men are Confederate soldiers. They're part of John Hunt Morgan's command. Morgan was a Confederate raider. He made a ploy through Kentucky, Ohio, and got as far as just across the Ohio border near Beaver Falls. But in 1863, and this struck terror in the homeland because these were Confederate cavalrymen, and they were going to steal everything and take anything. The war was coming close. It was very scary, but they were captured. They rode far out of their range. Their horses broke down. They surrendered and were captured around Lisbon, Ohio. Some of them were sent to penitentiaries in Ohio, and these men were sent to Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, which is where the aviary is now today. And if you look at them, you can see the bars in the background.
Oh, yeah.
Here's a photograph that a photographer is going to take to sell, to make money, because these guys are rock stars. Confederate cavalrymen, the women are swooning, and they're so dashing, and look at their boots, and they were just They were the beau ideal of soldiers. And they had honor passes, which meant they could walk out of the prison and walk into town and buy goods, and then they were honored to go back to prison. So these men signed autographs in Pittsburgh. They talked to people. They were invited to theater shows. They were really the hit of the town. And this picture is called Happy Family, and they're showing they have wine and tobacco and food, and not like Northern soldiers who are probably at the very same time suffering in the Andersonville prison. But these men were eventually exchanged. During that time of the war, they would exchange officer for officer, man for man, kind of like we're looking at today. In fact, I've heard some news commentators talking about the exchange process and it going back as far as the Civil War. And that is true. There is a precedent for it. Next, please. This slide is, well, there's two slides. The one on the right is a very famous picture taken in the rocks at Devil's Den at Gettysburg of what appeared to be dead soldiers. And this, again, was a photographer's attempt to sell photos. Now, the man on the left is a man called Jacob Schenkel. He's a Pittsburgher. He was a musician in the 62nd Pennsylvania. And during a battle, musicians didn't fight. Their task was to gather wounded and take them to field hospitals. And then they were to attend the wounded in field hospitals. And when the armies left Gettysburg, July 7th and 8th, Schenkel was detailed to stay behind at the hospitals and work there. And, he kept a diary, and in that diary was recently discovered, I'm going to say recently, 20 years ago. Before that fact, people assumed that some people thought these photographs were actually dead soldiers, and some questioned, they're not really bloated, or they don't show the signs of being dead in July. Is it a gag photo? We didn't know until Schenkel's diary appeared, where he talked about the week before Lincoln came to give a Gettysburg address. Schenkel and a few other men were paid by a photographer to go out with him and pose on the rocks as if they were dead. This is Schenkel right here in the middle. That's him laying right there. So now we know the identity of one of the dead guys who's not really dead. And he's a Pittsburgher. Next, please. This is Colonel John Clark. He was a minister on the north side, a Presbyterian minister. And in 1862, he challenged his congregation to join up and fight the Confederates and join the Union Army. And within 5 days, he had enough men to have a whole regiment. A regiment is 1,000 men. So a lot of the men of his congregation and their friends all enlisted. It was a very short-termed regiment. It was a 9-month regiment. Typical enlistments were 3 years. But Clark's regiment served most notably at the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was a debacle for the Union. The Confederates were on a hill behind a stone wall, and the Federal armies led charge after charge after charge after charge to try to break them out of there, and they did not. And Clark's regiment was one of the last regiments of the day to make that charge. And if you can imagine what they saw as they went up the slope of Marie's Heights were thousands of bodies, thousands of wounded, and they were going into that same grinding machine, and they knew it. And they got pretty beat up there. They continued to serve till Chancellorsville in May of 1863 when they were mustered out. But Clark was a big hero. There were songs written about him. He actually went back in the Army and led a colored regiment, a black regiment. He was the colonel of that regiment as well. But most of his combat experience happened with the 123rd. Next, please. Yeah, there were some women in the Civil War. They weren't combatants. There were very few. There were some women who tried to pass as men. Some were successful, some weren't. It's thought there were less than 20 in the whole Union and Confederate armies together. Of course, there may be some that are not known, and some that were discovered only very late in life. But there were some positions for women in the field. She's dressed in the uniform of a vivandière. It's a French term. These were women in the French army who marched with the soldiers, repaired their clothing in camp, And in battle, they carried them whiskey or rum or water to revive their spirits. And they were actually went out among the wounded and did that. This woman's name is, she was called French Mary. Her name is Mary Tepee. She originally was married to a man in the 27th Pennsylvania, Bernard Tepee. But he abandoned her and stole her money. And she didn't really, that wasn't really a good thing to do, but she stayed in the army. She was wounded in the heel at Fredericksburg. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, she again was out on the battlefield tending to wounded. Her skirts were riddled with bullets. She was noticed in the middle of the fighting, serving the men, and she was awarded a medal called the Kearney Cross. It was a Valor Medal. It's before the Medal of Honor was a part of our tradition, our military tradition. But it was a divisional medal for gallantry, and she was awarded that medal. She eventually met a guy named Richard Leonard, who was a trooper in the 1st Maryland Cavalry that was recruited here in Pittsburgh. She got married and settled in Baldwin, Pennsylvania, opened a candy store, had a very rocky relationship with her husband, Richard Leonard, filed for divorce once. They never were divorced. But she suffered from her wound. Her wound pained her all her life. And by 1901, she was a rheumatic invalid. And she ended her life by drinking poison, a poison called Paris Green, which was a rodent killer. And she is, she's buried, oh, I forgot where she's buried. I had it on my other list. She's buried here in Pittsburgh. And only recently was her grave marked properly. And I'm sorry I don't have that information with me, but I could get it for you if you're interested. Let's look at the next slide. This is showing, the camera is showing us, again, war on the doorstep of Pennsylvania. In 1863, the Confederate Army invaded Pennsylvania. One was Morgan's men to the west, and Lee's army was coming up from the south and penetrating into York, Carlisle, Harrisburg, and threatening Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, like Pittsburgh, built defenses, forts. The people of Pittsburgh were terrified, as were the citizens of Philadelphia. And they constructed earthen forts. There were 13 or so of them around Pittsburgh. There's still the remnants, or 1 or 2 on Mount Washington today. But this is what they looked like, and these would be used. This picture was actually taken in 1863 in Philadelphia. So there would be, these are positions for militia troops to hide behind. There would be a cannon or 2. They were just perimeter defenses to help guard the city. Next, please. I talked about Marie Tepee's Kearney Cross. This is a Medal of Honor. Some people call it a Congressional Medal of Honor, but it was first initiated during the Civil War by the United States government. It started with men who stole the train, the Andrews Raiders, who stole the train, the General, in Atlanta. Disney made a movie out of it in the 1960s. But they were awarded a special medal, and that became a precedent, and we still have that tradition today. Although the bar has been raised during the Civil War, if you turned in a Confederate flag, one would assume you captured it and fought hand to hand. But if you found it laying on the ground and turned it in, they didn't ask you where you got it. You were just recorded in the minutes, in the record, and you would receive a Medal of Honor. This one is, we have this one in Soldiers and Sailors. It was given to a cavalry soldier from Pittsburgh who received it for turning in a flag in 1865. Let's look at the next slide. African Americans were not permitted to serve in the Federal Army until 1863. When the war broke out, there were a number of militia companies of African Americans that offered their service to the Federal Army and were rejected, unfortunately. But by 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation, and he makes it legal for African Americans to join the Union Army, and creates a number of regiments. This is the 6th U.S. Colored Troops, is what they're called, United States Colored Troops. The 6th was primarily from the Pittsburgh area. There were a number of other regiments like the 32nd, I think the 28th, had large contributions of men that were also in the Colored Troops. They went on to fight in many battles. They were great soldiers. They proved their mettle. And forgive me, I forget this man's name, but he was from Monongahela, Pennsylvania. Next, please. This young lad, he's wearing a uniform similar to Marie Tepee. These uniforms were the uniforms based on very colorful uniforms from the northern African regions, the Algeria, Morocco, and the soldiers were called Zouaves. And they were, in those areas, they were known for their prowess. They were like elite troops. And there was a Zouave craze here in the United States, and some regiments were outfitted in the Zouave dress. A regiment from Pittsburgh, the 155th, commissioned, they were a great regiment, they commissioned these uniforms in 1864 and wore them from 1864 to 65. They wore them at the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. This young man's name is William Montgomery, and he is from Pittsburgh, and he has the unfortunate honor of being the last Union soldier killed in the Civil War. He was killed while the troops were formed up at Appomattox. A Confederate cannon shot a cannonball. The burst hit him in the shoulder. He lived for a very short time, but he died, and then the peace flags were raised. So he was very unfortunate to be the last Union soldier. Next, please. So we're gonna look a little past the war now, because the camera is going to tell us what happened to these young men who now become old men. This soldier, he lost his right eye in a coal mining accident. He didn't have a very glorious war record. His name was Jacob Souls, but he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. He was at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th, 1865, when Lincoln was shot, and he was he was a Pittsburgher from Thompson's Battery. He and his buddies snuck into the theater, and they were watching the play. When Lincoln was shot, they rushed up to the booth, and he and a few of his buddies helped carry Lincoln's body from Ford's Theater across to the house where he died, across the street, the Peterson house. And he never talked about it until later in his life, and then there were several stories done about it. Next, please. This is a 75th anniversary coin that was issued in 1938 for the 75th anniversary of Gettysburg. And I show this, first of all, if you collect coins, this is kind of a rare coin. They made, I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of them, but they weren't popular, and they kind of recalled them, so there are very few in circulation. They're kind of rare, but the reason I show it is it was sculpted by a Pittsburgher named Frank Vittori, who did a number of monuments around town. He did the Honus Wagner baseball monument that's down at the PNC Park, and he did the Columbus statue that's at Phipps. Among others, there are a number of monuments. He worked in the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s. The man on the first man, the bas-relief, is a man named James Sankey, and he was a 16-year-old soldier. He lied about his age. He was from Allegheny County, and that's his picture. So there's a great Pittsburgh connection between those two men. Next, please. This is the Pennsylvania Monument at Gettysburg. And the reason I show this is the guy who looks like Colonel Sanders over here. His name is Charles McKenna. He was one of the men. He was in the 155th Pennsylvania, that Zouave regiment. He was a private. He became a very important political person in the Pittsburgh area. He's one of the founders of Soldiers and Sailors. And he was on the battlefield 50th anniversary commission at the Battle of Gettysburg, and standing beside him is Joshua Chamberlain from Little Round Top. It's an unknown photograph of Chamberlain. Chamberlain visited the battlefield in May to help work on the details of the reunion that was about to occur in July, and he got sick, and he was not able to attend the reunion. So this is the last time he was in Gettysburg, and he passed away in the fall of 1913. So it's a great picture with the Pennsylvania Monument, which was just dedicated that day. That's why they were there. Next picture. So this is the GAR. I don't know if you're familiar with it. The Grand Army of the Republic was the veterans organization that the Civil War soldiers formed, and it was there. They had meetings in every little town, and they had posts, and it was very politically motivated. They were powerful. This photograph is of a Pittsburgh meeting rally in 1910. You can see the sea of white-haired men on the stage are the flags from their posts. I want to go to the next slide, please. Here's a little more detail of the slide where you can see some of the men's faces and their their flags. The reason I'm showing you this, and we're looking again at the camera, I want you to look at that eagle that's there, and then please go to the next slide. This is taken at Soldiers and Sailors. We have a great photo depository of the GAR posts, all consolidated and met at Soldiers and Sailors from 1910 on. We have all their record books, many of their photographs. If you have a chance and would like to come see, please come see Soldiers and Sailors, because it looks just like it did in those photographs. That auditorium is exactly the same. There's a Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is on the back wall. The eagles, the painting, the ceiling, it's exactly like it was in 1910, and it's a real treasure and a jewel. So with that, that's my last slide. I bring us right up to the future, and I would gladly welcome questions if people had them. Question in the back.
Yeah, so Sailors and Soldiers and Sailors Hall
Yes.
is a meeting place?
Soldiers and Sailors Hall is a memorial, first of all. It was opened in 1910. It was a memorial to Civil War soldiers. They requested it to be built. The county built it. The 25,490 names are all on bronze plaques all around the inside of the hall. And it was an auditorium, essentially, like a memorial auditorium. And it was owned by the county and ran by the county for many years. It started to become a museum in 1911 or 1912. People started bringing things there and wanted to deposit them. And people still do. I had 4 calls today of people with World War II uniforms or pieces that want to donate them to Soldiers and Sailors. And we have displays that go from the Civil War all the way to Iraq and Afghanistan. And our mission is to honor American soldiers because it's been passed down from Civil War soldiers to the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and now we're trying to involve Iraq and Afghanistan veterans in what we do. Yes, ma'am.
How did Lincoln get to Gettysburg? Did he by any chance go to Pittsburgh?
No, he didn't. The rail lines, let's see, he would have gone to Baltimore and then taken a train from Baltimore west to Harrisburg or Gettysburg. There was a train line in Gettysburg. In fact, you know, he didn't come here very often because it wasn't easy to get here. The rail lines went through the mountains, and they were owned by different rail companies. So you had to change trains often, and it wasn't as easy as it is now. In fact, it was easier to go west than it was to go east. So he would have traveled from Washington to Baltimore to Gettysburg. Yes.
The slide of Mr. Souls.
Yes.
He lived in an area of suburb of Pittsburgh called West Wilmerding.
That's right. That's
I
right.
grew up there.
Yeah.
My mother was born in 1918, and she knew of him
Okay.
as a young child.
He was a local legend that had been at Lincoln's assassination.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a number of newspaper articles from that era where they interviewed old Mr. Souls and you know, asked for his reminiscence of that famous night. Yes?
Just for information, would you mind mentioning that Lincoln was through here
Yes.
on his inauguration?
Yeah, Lincoln did travel through here in February 14th, 1861. Before he had won the presidential election and was on his way to the inauguration. He stayed at the Monongahela House, which on that very first woodcut slide when I showed the Smithfield Street Bridge, the Monongahela House was right there on the end of there. And he spoke to the crowd. There was a balcony on the second floor. He popped out and spoke. It was a bitter, spitting, rainy February day, and he didn't say much, but there were 10,000 people waiting for him to talk. And he also spoke in the lobby briefly of the Monongahela House. Yes.
Exactly how close did the Confederates get to Pittsburgh?
I would have to say it was Morgan's men, and it was Lisbon, Ohio, and around Beaver Falls was the closest penetration. There were a number of threats. There were always rumors and threats. And Pittsburgh was a hotbed. I mean, not everybody was a Union person here because of the river traffic, you know, going up and down the Mississippi. So there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers here in town, which I find hard to believe, but there really were. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Very good photograph. Several things. Please join our group if you haven't. We have a tradition of co-op putting the chairs away. If we could get some help on that. I forgot one speech that has been set for this winter, which is the history of Presbyterianism in Western Pennsylvania. So we have a nice variety of things. Thank you for coming. We'll see you again.